if I told you that one of the greatest kingdoms of the Middle Ages fell not because of the strength of an enemy army, but because of a single fateful decision? History often focuses on battles and swords, but the Battle of Hattin was won not only by steel, but also by the sun, thirst, and the genius of one man. This is the story of how, in 3 days, the most powerful army of Crusaders the East had ever seen was reduced to dust. This conflict was the culmination of decades of political intrigue, religious zeal, and personal ambition. On one side was a divided kingdom rife with internal strife. On the other was the united Islamic world under the banner of Sultan Saladin. The battle that followed was not just a clash, but a strategic masterpiece that forever changed the map of the Holy Land. Here, on the scorched plateau in Galilee, the fate of Jerusalem and the dream of a Christian East were decided. Every step, every order, and every sip of water mattered. The mistake made by the Crusader leaders was so fatal that they had no chance of salvation. Watch this video to the end to find out how Saladin managed to lure the entire army of the Kingdom of Jerusalem into a waterless trap, and which one night was the main reason for this crushing defeat.
I tell you, the gold changed hands yesterday.
Are you certain? If the master finds out...
He must find out before we are all undone.
I will reveal to you a secret that is often overlooked. By 1187, the Kingdom of Jerusalem was ready to collapse from within. What if I told you that the main enemy of the Crusaders was not so much the Saracens as themselves? The political scene in Jerusalem was split into two irreconcilable factions, and their struggle made disaster inevitable. The first faction, the Peace Party, was led by Raymond III, Count of Tripoli. He was one of the few local barons born in the Holy Land. Raymond understood the region, spoke Arabic, and advocated pragmatic coexistence with Muslim neighbors, including Saladin. He knew that the kingdom was too small and vulnerable to survive in a state of perpetual war, and he actively supported a truce. He was opposed by the war party, consisting of newly arrived European knights and the heads of military monastic orders. Their leaders were the odious Renaud de Chatillon, Prince of Transjordan, and Gerard de Ridefort, Master of the Knights Templar. They despised any treaties with the infidels and saw their mission as one of constant, aggressive expansion. Renaud de Chatillon was a true provocateur whose actions led directly to war. He controlled the fortress of Kerak, from which he made daring raids on Muslim caravans and pilgrims. His main dream was to attack the holy cities of Mecca and Medina, which was an unthinkable insult to the entire Islamic world. Gerard de Ridefort, Master of the Knights Templar, was no less belligerent. He used his enormous influence to push the kingdom toward confrontation. He also had a personal score to settle with Raymond of Tripoli, which made their political confrontation a personal vendetta as well. Caught between these two fires was the King of Jerusalem, Guy de Lusignan. He was king only by marriage and had neither the authority nor the political will to control his vassals. Weak and indecisive, he constantly wavered, trying to please both sides. It was this weakness that led to tragedy. The war party gradually gained complete control over the king. They craved glory and plunder, ignoring Raymond's warnings about Saladin's growing power. Their arrogance and fanaticism blinded them. The last straw was another act of piracy by Renaud de Chatillon in 1186. He attacked a rich caravan traveling from Cairo to Damascus, capturing many people, including, according to some sources, Saladin's own sister. This was a violation of the existing truce. Saladin, who by this time had united Egypt and Syria, demanded the release of the captives and the return of the goods. King Guy ordered Renaud to obey, but he demonstratively refused, declaring that in his lands he was as much a king as Guy. For Saladin, this was the excuse he had been waiting for. The truce was broken. He vowed to personally finish off Renaud de Chatillon and began to assemble a huge army for a holy war. The divided kingdom, paralyzed by internal strife, found itself on the verge of the greatest test in its history. We are very interested in hearing your opinion. What do you think about historical figures such as Renaud de Chatillon? Were they fanatics, adventurers, or simply products of their era? Write about it in the comments, and don't forget to subscribe to our channel so you don't miss our analysis of other key moments in history.
Steady, men!
Are you ready to learn the truth about how Saladin got his enemy to do exactly what he wanted? Saladin was not just a warrior, he was a master of strategy and psychology. He was well aware of the division among the Crusaders and decided to use it to his advantage. His goal was not just to win another border skirmish, but to force a decisive battle and destroy the entire army of the Kingdom of Jerusalem in one fell swoop. To do this, he needed to lure the Crusaders out of their fortified castles and cities. He understood that the Frankish army was strong in defense, but vulnerable in the field. He needed bait so valuable that the war party could not ignore it. In May 1187, Saladin gathered forces from all corners of his empire, from Egypt, Syria, and Mesopotamia. His army was one of the largest the region had ever seen. He crossed the Jordan and demonstratively set up camp, awaiting the Franks' reaction. Raymond of Tripoli made the first move. In his domain, not far from Tiberias, there was a small detachment of Templars and Hospitallers. Gerard de Ridford, master of the Templars, decided to make a daring sortie against Saladin's detachment. Raymond begged him not to do so, but Gerard accused him of cowardice. As a result, at the source of the Crusade, a small detachment of knights attacked an army of many thousands. It was not a battle, but suicide. Almost all the knights were destroyed, including the master of the Hospitallers. Gerard de Ridford was one of the few who escaped, covering himself with shame. This disaster seemed to have sobered up the war party, but it had the opposite effect. The defeat only fueled their fury. Meanwhile, Saladin made his masterstroke. On July 2, 1187, he laid siege to the city of Tiberias, which belonged to the wife of Raymond of Tripoli. The fortress of Tiberias itself was well defended, but the lower city was taken almost immediately. Raymond's wife, Ashiva, found herself locked in the citadel. It was a personal, painful, and public attack on Raymond's honor. Saladin knew what he was doing. All the barons of the kingdom and King Guy gathered for a council of war in Acre. The Crusader army was in full combat readiness at the camp near the springs of Sepphoris. It was an ideal location with abundant water and pasture. The question was, what to do? Raymond of Tripoli, despite the fact that his wife was under siege, made a strikingly calm speech. He begged the king not to move. He said that Tiberias was a trap, that Saladin was deliberately provoking them. He suggested sacrificing the city and his wife, but preserving the army, the kingdom's only defense. But then Gerard de Ridford stepped in. Eager for revenge for the disgrace at Cresson, he began to openly accuse Raymond of cowardice and even of colluding with Saladin. He declared that it was unbecoming of a king to allow the enemy to burn cities in his kingdom. He was supported by Renaud de Chatillon. King Guy hesitated all night. Logic was on Raymond's side, but the pressure from the war party was unbearable. Towards morning, Gerard de Ridford came to the king's tent and convinced him that inaction would cover him with eternal shame. Guy de Lusignan broke down and gave the fateful order to march on Tiberias. What do you think motivated Gerard de Ridford at that moment? Sincere zeal, a thirst for revenge, or political ambition? This question remains one of the most controversial in the history of the Crusades. In the next chapter, you will learn how this one order turned the largest crusade into a slow march toward its own destruction. What I am about to show you is banned in 12 countries. Just kidding, but what the Crusaders did was against all the rules of military logic. On the morning of July 3rd, 1187, the greatest army of the Kingdom of Jerusalem left the cool, water-rich camp in Sepphoris and headed for hell. Their path lay across a scorched plateau known for its lack of water. It was a unique sight. Nearly 2,000 knights in full armor, the cream of European nobility in the Holy Land. They were followed by more than 15,000 infantrymen, archers, and crossbowmen. At the center of this army, as a symbol of their faith and hope, they carried the greatest relic, a fragment of the true cross. However, this force had a fatal vulnerability, which Saladin was well aware of. The army was completely dependent on water, especially in the scorching heat of July. The route they chose was about 25 kilometers long, but it ran through an area where there was not a single stream or well. Their plan was to reach the springs near the village of Hattin, but this was an optimistic calculation. Just a few hours after the march began, reality began to take its toll. The July sun was at its zenith, and the temperature in the shade was approaching 40 degrees. The soldiers and knights were clad in heavy armor. The metal and leather undergarments turned into veritable ovens. The water they carried with them in wineskins quickly ran out. Every step was incredibly difficult. Saladin did not engage in open combat. He used his light cavalry, thousands of mounted archers. They swarmed like wasps over the stretched-out column of Crusaders. They attacked from the flanks and rear, firing clouds of arrows, and then immediately retreated, preventing the heavy cavalry of the Franks from counterattacking. These attacks did not cause enormous damage, but they accomplished three important tasks. First, they exhausted the army, forcing the knights to remain constantly on alert. Second, they slowed down the movement of the column. Third, they sowed fear and uncertainty. But Saladin had another more terrifying weapon: fire. His soldiers set fire to the dry bushes and grass that covered the plateau. The wind drove the smoke and flames straight into the faces of the Crusaders. The air was filled with acrid smoke, which made it difficult to breathe and increased thirst even more. By noon, the march had turned into a chaotic, slow movement. The infantry, suffering most from thirst, began to fall behind. Discipline was crumbling before their eyes. Soldiers threw down their shields and equipment just to keep moving forward. By evening, the Crusader army was completely demoralized and exhausted. They had only traveled about 18 kilometers, but were on the verge of collapse. They never made it to the springs of Hattin. Instead, they were forced to camp on a dry, waterless hill known as the Horns of Hattin. This was exactly what Saladin wanted. He lured the enemy into a trap, and he didn't have to lose a single soldier in a major battle to do so. The sun, thirst, and his opponent's own stupidity did most of the work for him. If you like how we analyze the tactical and psychological aspects of great battles, please like this video. It helps us create more content like this. Guess what happened next? The Crusader army, exhausted from the day's march, settled down for the night on a hill that became their prison. The place, known as the Horns of Hattin, consisted of two rocky peaks with a small valley between them. There was not a drop of water to be found. The soldiers fell to the ground, unable even to pitch their tents. Their thirst was unbearable. The warriors, who had been full of determination and pride that morning, now thought of only one thing: water. Their voices were hoarse, and their strength had left them. King Guy, Renaud de Chatillon, and other barons gathered for a last desperate council. Raymond of Tripoli, whose worst fears had come true, remained gloomily silent. Now everyone understood that they had fallen into a trap, but there was no turning back. Meanwhile, Saladin's army had completely surrounded the hill, but they were in no hurry to attack. Instead, they set up camp at the only source of water in the area, near the village of Hattin. The Crusaders could see the lights of their camp and hear the sounds, but they could not reach them. It was a sophisticated form of psychological torture. Saladin's soldiers, fresh and rested, demonstratively approached the streams, filled their water skins, and talked loudly. They carried the sounds of water to the ears of the besieged. Moreover, Saladin's men continued to set fire to the bushes around the hill throughout the night. Acrid smoke enveloped the Crusaders' camp, making it difficult for them to breathe and intensifying their already unbearable thirst. They spent the night in smoke, fear, and despair. Saladin also ordered caravans with water from Lake Tiberias to be brought to the front line. Dozens of camels loaded with water skins passed in full view of the Crusaders, and all this water was demonstratively poured onto the ground or given to the horses. It was a tactical genius move. Saladin did not just deprive the enemy of water, he broke their morale. He showed them that all sources of life were now in his hands. By morning, the Crusader army was not only physically exhausted, it was psychologically crushed. Many infantrymen, driven mad by thirst, tried to desert during the night and break through to the water. They descended the hill and either fell into the hands of Saladin's warriors or were simply not allowed to reach the sources. By dawn on July 4th, 1187, the army of the Kingdom of Jerusalem was a shadow of its former self. It was a crowd of exhausted people who could barely hold their weapons. Opposite them stood Saladin's fresh, disciplined, and highly motivated army, ready to deliver the final decisive blow. What is it like to spend the night surrounded by the enemy, knowing that life-saving water is just a few hundred meters away, but impossible to reach? In the next chapter, you will learn how the decisive day of battle unfolded and which of the barons made a desperate attempt to break through. With the first rays of the sun on July 4th, the battle resumed, but it was no longer a battle, but a predetermined conclusion. The Crusader army was completely surrounded. Saladin gave the order to attack from all sides. His troops were fresh, they had breakfast and drank clean water, while the Franks could barely stand on their feet. The infantry were the first to falter. Driven mad by thirst, they no longer obeyed orders. Thousands of them threw down their weapons and tried to break through the hill to the northeast toward Lake Tiberias, which was vaguely visible in the distance. They were not running toward victory, but toward water. This spontaneous breakthrough was exactly what Saladin had been waiting for. His cavalry easily cut through the crowd of infantry, separating them from the knightly cavalry. Most of the infantry were either killed or taken prisoner before they reached the water. The Crusader army lost its infantry support. Only the knights, barons, and King Guy de Lusignan remained on the hill. They huddled around the main shrine, the True Cross. This was their last line of defense. They knew there was no escape and prepared to fight their last battle. Raymond of Tripoli, seeing that all was lost, decided to make a desperate attempt to break through. Gathering his knights from Tripoli around him, he led a powerful cavalry attack on the position of one of Saladin's emirs. Something strange happened. Instead of meeting the attack head-on, the Saracen troops parted and created a corridor. Raymond and his detachment broke through the encirclement and rode away from the battlefield. Historians still argue whether this was an act of treachery, which Saladin rewarded, or a tactical decision by the Sultan, who allowed the most intelligent of his enemies to leave so that he would no longer interfere. Either way, with Raymond gone, only the most ardent supporters of the war party remained on the hill, those who had led the army into this trap. King Guy, Renaud de Chatillon, Gerard de Riedfort, and the Knights of the Orders. They made 2 or 3 desperate suicidal attacks from the hill. They tried to break through to Saladin himself, seeing this as their only chance to turn the tide of battle. But their attacks were repelled by the disciplined ranks of the Sultan's army. Each time the knights were thrown back up the hill. Their horses fell, but they dismounted and continued to fight. But the forces were unequal. Saladin's army tightened its ring. The Crusaders retreated to the very top, where the red royal tent stood. The battle turned into a defense of a single patch of land. Saladin's warriors stormed the hill. They captured the Bishop of Acre, who was carrying the True Cross. The greatest relic of the Christian world was now in the hands of the Muslims. It was a moral blow that finally broke the will of the defenders. Finally, Saladin's warriors broke through to the royal tent. One of them tore down the banner, which signaled the end. The battle was over. The surviving knights, including the king himself, were surrounded and taken prisoner. What if I told you that the most dramatic events of the battle took place after the weapons had fallen silent? The fall of King Guy de Lusignan's red tent on top of the hill was the final point of the battle. It was not just the capture of the standard, it was a symbol of the fall of the entire kingdom. The army that 2 days earlier had been the pride of the Christian world ceased to exist. The exhausted, dust-covered, and desperate leaders of the Crusaders were brought to Saladin's tent. Among the prisoners were the most prominent figures: King Guy de Lusignan, his brother Amalric, the master of the Knights Templar, Gerard de Riedfort, and of course the main instigator of the war, Renaud de Chatillon. Saladin, like a true monarch, showed mercy to the defeated king. He seated Guy de Lusignan next to him. Seeing that the king was dying of thirst, the Sultan ordered a bowl of ice water, sweetened with rose syrup, to be brought to him. It was a gesture of hospitality. King Guy drank from the cup and, according to European custom, passed it to Renaud de Chatillon. This gesture had unforeseen consequences. According to the laws of Arab hospitality, whoever gave food or water to a prisoner gave him life. Saladin gave water to the king, but not to Renaud. When Renaud took the cup, Saladin immediately turned to the interpreter. He ordered him to tell King Guy, "You gave him a drink, not me. This man will receive no mercy from me." For Saladin, it was a personal moment. He had sworn to finish Renaud off, and the hour had come. The Sultan turned to Renaud de Chatillon and listed all his crimes: violating truces, robbing caravans, attacking pilgrims. He offered him a choice, but Renaud, even in captivity, responded insolently and arrogantly. Then Saladin fulfilled his oath himself. He took his sword and struck. The fate of Renaud de Chatillon, the man who had ignited this war, was decided on the spot. It was not an act of cruelty, but the execution of a sentence that Saladin had passed many years ago. The other barons and King Guy were terrified, expecting the same fate to befall them. But Saladin reassured them. He told the king that monarchs do not treat other monarchs this way, but Renaud had crossed all boundaries. Guy de Lusignan's life was safe. This episode showed two sides of Saladin: merciful and chivalrous towards the king, and unyielding and just towards those he considered criminals. The fate of the other prisoners varied. The noble barons and the king were spared for ransom. The ordinary foot soldiers were sold into slavery. But there was one group to which Saladin showed no mercy. Do you think Saladin's actions can be considered just retribution? Or was it an act of revenge disguised as justice? In the next chapter, we will learn what fate befell the most fanatical warriors of the Kingdom of Jerusalem. Once the fate of the high-ranking prisoners had been decided, Saladin turned his attention to a special group of warriors. These were the knights of the military monastic orders, the Templars and the Hospitallers. Several hundred of these elite fighters had been taken prisoner, including their master Gerard de Ridford. Saladin's attitude toward these men was fundamentally different from his attitude toward the secular barons. He respected them as warriors. They were the ones who had put up the fiercest resistance on the hill. But he also saw them as the main threat to peace in the region. Unlike the barons, who could make truces and be guided by political expediency, the knights of the orders were subject only to their statutes and the Pope. They were ideologically motivated warriors who had dedicated their lives to fighting. Saladin believed that as long as these orders existed, the kingdom would always have a professional, fanatical army ready to break any treaty. They were the backbone of the Franks' military power, and now almost all of their leaders were in his hands. The Sultan understood that releasing them for ransom, like ordinary knights, would be a strategic mistake. They would immediately return to the ranks and continue the war. Keeping them in prison was also not an option. Therefore, Saladin made a harsh decision. He offered each knight monk a choice. They could save their lives, but to do so, they had to convert to Islam. For warriors who had taken vows, this was unthinkable. On the evening of July 4th, all the captured Templars and Hospitallers were gathered together. Chroniclers report that none of them wavered. They were warriors to the end and refused to renounce their faith. Saladin gave an order that eliminated this threat once and for all. All the knights of the orders were executed. It was a cold-blooded decision, but from Saladin's point of view, it was an absolutely logical and necessary military decision. He decapitated the enemy army in both the literal and figurative sense. The only exception was made for one man, the Grand Master of the Knights Templar, Gerard de Ridford. He, like King Guy, was left alive for ransom. This decision would later come back to haunt Saladin, but at that moment, he spared the leader. This act is often cited as an example of Saladin's cruelty, but in fact it was dictated by pure strategic calculation. He did not harbor personal hatred towards them, as he did towards Renaud de Chatillon. He simply eliminated the most dangerous and irreconcilable part of the enemy's military machine. The Battle of Hattin did not just destroy the army, it eliminated its professional corps. The Kingdom of Jerusalem could no longer recover such a loss in manpower, and more importantly, in experience. The consequences of this decision were immediate. The military orders were the only force capable of effectively defending the kingdom's numerous castles. Now there was no one to defend them. The victory at Hattin was not just a major victory, it was the complete annihilation of the enemy's military force. In 2 days, the Kingdom of Jerusalem lost virtually its entire army, infantry, knights, and leaders. The news spread throughout the Holy Land with incredible speed, and the effect was staggering. The Crusader kingdom was a network of castles and fortified port cities connected by roads. Their security depended on garrisons and a field army that could come to the aid of those under siege. Now that army no longer existed. Saladin did not celebrate his victory or rest. He immediately began to reap the fruits of Hattin. He understood that he had to act quickly before the Franks recovered from the shock and received reinforcements from Europe. He divided his army and began to methodically capture one city after another. A domino effect began. Tiberias was the first to fall. The citadel surrendered the day after the battle. Saladin graciously released the wife of Raymond of Tripoli and her garrison. Then it was the turn of the largest port and main base of the kingdom, Acre. The city, deprived of its defenders, who remained at the horns of Hattin, surrendered on July 8th, just 4 days after the battle. Saladin got his hands on enormous riches, arsenals, and a fleet. His army then moved south along the coast. Haifa, Caesarea, and Arsuf fell. Raymond of Tripoli, who had fled the battlefield, took refuge in his county but soon died, rumored to be from grief and shame. His lands also came under Saladin's control. During September, Jaffa, Sidon, Beirut, and Ascalon fell. Castles that were considered impregnable surrendered one after another. They simply had no garrisons. Sometimes a small detachment was enough to capture a powerful fortress. The only major city on the coast that held out was Tyre. The few survivors of Hattin flocked there, and the defense of the city was led by the energetic Conrad of Montferrat, who had arrived by chance from Constantinople. He organized the defense and repelled Saladin's first attack. But this was only a minor exception. Less than 3 months after the Battle of Hattin, almost the entire kingdom of Jerusalem, which the Crusaders had been building for almost a century, ceased to exist. All that remained was the besieged Tyre and a few isolated castles deep within the territory. Saladin demonstrated not only tactical genius in battle, but also brilliant strategic vision. He did not besiege the most powerful fortresses, but first took control of the ports, cutting the kingdom off from Europe. This entire lightning campaign had one main goal. Once the entire coast was in his hands, Saladin turned his army toward the heart of the kingdom. He headed for the main prize, the symbol of the entire war, Jerusalem. By mid-September 1187, Jerusalem remained the last major stronghold of the Franks, apart from Tyre. The city was flooded with refugees from fallen cities and castles, but there were almost no warriors left in it. The entire professional army that was supposed to defend it remained lying on the plateau at Hattin. The defense of the city was unwittingly led by Balian of Ibelin, one of the few barons who managed to escape the encirclement at Hattin. He was a pragmatic and respected man, similar in disposition to Raymond of Tripoli. He understood that it was impossible to hold the city. When Saladin's army approached the walls on September 20th, Balian tried to negotiate an honorable surrender. But Saladin, intoxicated by a series of victories, refused. He declared that he would take the city by force, just as the Franks had taken it in 1099. This reference to 1099 was not accidental. The capture of Jerusalem by the First Crusade was accompanied by a horrific massacre, which the Muslim world still remembered. Saladin wanted to repay them in kind. The siege began. Saladin's troops set up siege engines and began shelling the walls. But the defenders, despite their small numbers, fought desperately. Balian d'Ibelin even knighted dozens of ordinary townspeople to raise morale. Seeing the stubborn resistance and not wanting to suffer heavy losses, Saladin moved his camp and concentrated his attack on another, more vulnerable section of the wall. His engineers began digging a tunnel under one of the towers. A few days later, on September 29th, the wall collapsed at the point where the tunnel had been dug. A huge breach was formed in the city's defenses. It became clear that an assault was inevitable, and the city would fall within a few hours. The defenders were in despair. At this critical moment, Balian d'Ibelin took a last desperate step. He went to negotiate with Saladin again, but this time his tone was different. He no longer asked for mercy. Balian told the Sultan that if he did not accept an honorable surrender, the defenders of the city would do the unthinkable. They would destroy all the Muslim shrines in the city, including the Dome of the Rock and the Al-Aqsa Mosque. Then they would kill all the Muslim prisoners and their wives and children, after which they would go out to fight a final battle to the death, taking as many of Saladin's soldiers with them as possible. It was an unthinkable threat, but Saladin understood that desperate people were capable of such things. He could not allow the destruction of Islam's third holiest site. His advisors also urged him to show mercy and not to mar a great victory with senseless cruelty. Saladin hesitated. He was a warrior but also a pious ruler. He did not want his name to be associated with the same barbarism that the Crusaders had displayed in 1099. In the end, he agreed. He accepted Balian's terms of surrender. This decision demonstrated his greatness not only as a military leader, but also as a statesman. The terms of surrender that Saladin offered Jerusalem were surprisingly lenient and civilized for that era. They were strikingly different from what had happened in the city 88 years earlier. Saladin demonstrated to the whole world what chivalrous generosity was. The city was given 40 days to collect the ransom. Every Christian man had to pay 10 dinars, every woman 5, and every child 1. Those who could pay were given their freedom and the right to leave with their possessions for Tyre. It was a humane decision, but thousands of poor people and refugees in the city did not have that kind of money. Balian d'Ibelin used all the money left in the treasury and the treasures of the churches to ransom as many people as possible, but it was not enough. Here, Saladin showed mercy again. His brother Al-Adil and the Sultan himself paid the ransom for thousands of people from their personal funds. Moreover, Saladin allowed all elderly people to leave for free. He also ordered his soldiers to guard the columns of refugees heading for the coast so that no one would rob them. On October 2nd, 1187, on the anniversary of the ascension of the Prophet Muhammad, Saladin solemnly entered Jerusalem. He forbade his soldiers from looting or harming the inhabitants. Christian churches were left untouched, with the exception of the Church of the Holy Sepulchre, which was temporarily closed. The greatest relic, the true cross, captured at Hattin, was carried through the streets of the city and then sent to Damascus. The golden cross that the Crusaders had placed on the Dome of the Rock was removed, and the crescent was reinstalled. The fall of Jerusalem came as a shock to the entire Christian world. It was this news that led to the organization of the Third Crusade, led by the most powerful monarchs of Europe, including Richard the Lionheart. But that is a completely different story. The Battle of Hattin and the subsequent fall of Jerusalem marked the end of the First Kingdom of Jerusalem. It never recovered from this blow. Saladin's victory was total. It was achieved not only by force of arms, but also by force of mind. He used the enemy's arrogance, its internal divisions, and nature itself, the scorching sun and thirst, as his main allies. The story of Hattin is an eternal reminder of how one wrong decision, made under the pressure of emotion and pride, can destroy everything that has been built over almost a century. It was a triumph of strategy, patience, and psychological calculation. The Battle of Hattin was not just a battle, but a turning point in the history of the Middle Ages. In 2 days, the strategic map of the Holy Land changed beyond recognition. Saladin's genius lay not in winning the battle, but in making the battle itself inevitable and its outcome predetermined. What other battles or historical events, in your opinion, were decided not by force, but by cunning and strategy? Suggest topics for future videos that you would like to see on our channel in the comments. And don't forget to subscribe so you don't miss new in-depth dives into the most dramatic moments in history.